there's Jamie. Welcome, Jamie. We just started the webinar. So good evening and welcome to another Northshire Bookstore virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager in our Manchester, Vermont location, and we have an event that I've been really looking forward to tonight for a long time. But before we begin, a quick note. Please type any questions that you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. I'll save those up for you and pose them towards the end of tonight's event. And secondly, independent bookselling is a hard business in the best of times. So it's through your support and shopping locally at northshire.com that we're still around. So thank you so much. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Rose for her new book, Creating Stillness, Mindful Art Practices and Stories for Navigating Anxiety, Stress, and Fear. Rachel Rose is an educator, writer, and contemplative artist fusing mindfulness practices with the creative arts. She holds a master's in adult education with a focus on arts-based research and transformative learning, and is a registered expressive arts consultant educator with the International Expressive Art Therapy Association. Through her education portal, Workshop Muse, Rose has created both beacon and home for people to come to learn about creative knowing, as well as how to practice creative mindfulness in their own lives. She continues to champion her own creative practices, brings her awareness and insight. Her favorite tools for creation are textiles, paper, the natural world, and words. Rachel makes her home on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Calgary, Alberta. Jack Cornfield has said that Creating Stillness is a heartfelt, step-by-step guidebook to the deep healing that art can awaken, while Tara Brach has called it a welcoming and inspiring invitation to reconnect with our own wisdom and creativity. By fusing mindfulness with the expressive arts, we are guided in awakening our senses, healing our heart, and freeing our spirit. And we are lucky to be joined by fellow writer Jamie Marich tonight. They speak internationally on topics related to EMDR therapy, trauma, addiction, dissociation, expressive arts, yoga, and mindfulness, and maintains a private practice in her home base of Warren, Ohio. Marich has written numerous books, notably Trauma, The 12 Steps, An Inclusive Guide to Recovery, and most recently, Dissociation Made Simple. She's won numerous awards for LGBT+ and mental health advocacy, specifically in reducing stigma around dissociative disorders through the sharing of her own lived experience. And I'll put bio links in the chat in just a moment so for both books. So please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Jamie Marich and Rachel Rose.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy to be here.
I apologize for traipsing in late. It looks like the link I had saved was a bad link, so I'm glad you resent it out and I found you all. So I'm being joined by Misty. This is my office cat, my companion, and I'm here on, I just wanted to acknowledge as well, occupied Erie Nation land in Northeast Ohio. And Rachel, congratulations on your first book.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited to be here, excited to connect with you, and yeah, looking forward to questions and stuff too. It's always nice to like go away from writing in this solitary act to being out in the world sharing it, right?
Right. So yes, we share a publisher to those who are in on the website, and it was their idea to link us together for this conversation. So North Atlantic Books is they've published now my last 3 going on 4 books, and they're a group and organization that's really aligned with my values. And so I was delighted to see that they picked up your book because they do support artists and creativity and social justice. And it sounds like that is something that your work lives at the intersection of.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, actually, one of the editor that worked on my book, Shayna, just emailed me the other day to say congratulations. She said, I will miss our talks about creativity, expression, and capitalism. And I was like, I love that. I love that about, yeah, we were always, we're always trying to position things in contemporary times and the, social justice and where things sit and how we ethically want to show up in their work. And you're right, North Atlantic Books does really care about the ethics of how they show up and the authors that they support. And I think that that's a thread throughout my book as well too.
So there's my book. Creating Stillness. I always like to hold a copy of an author's book when I chat with them or interview them. So if you can walk us through the process of, because process is a word that's very important to expressive artists, which is also a field that I play in as well. I'm mostly known as a trauma specialist, yet I also am a registered expressive arts therapist. It's the clinical corollary to the credential that Rachel has. So tell us about the process of birthing this book and bringing it into existence.
Yeah. So, for me in my own practice, in my own work that I was doing, I've always been dabbling in the arts. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what expressive arts is, we'll just kind of maybe break that down because that's a phrase that sometimes people don't know. In the expressive arts, we really harness all of creativity and all of expression. So we're not just focused on visual arts or on movement or other, but we are focused on all types of expression, and we are focused on moving expressions from one medium to another too, right? So really anything in terms of creative expression is game, and we're always looking to kind of shift it and change it and see what we can learn as it moves, maybe from movement to poetry or visual arts to music or something like that. So for me, when I moved into expressive arts, I very much felt at home because I think for a long time, I used to tell myself the story that I had like, why couldn't I focus on one expressive medium? Like, why am I doing theater? And now I'm going to be a poet and I'm also painting, right? And so I realized once I started to move into it in the training sphere, I was like, oh, there's a reason why, right? And I think it took me a little while to figure that out, that this was all playing together and helping me make sense of things. And so in my own life, I really have used the arts to help make sense of whatever's going on for me, right? So I was just talking about this on a podcast the other day. I think I tend to show up when things are hard for me. I think I tend to be like, my anxiety is big or my grief is huge. And so I take that into my creative expression and play with it there. So the process of writing for me was that I had these like essays, these poems, these pieces of art. Like I kind of looked around and realized like I already had this kind of tracking of what this work looks like. And in my own practice, I was very much interested in learning mindfulness, the principles of mindfulness, practicing mindfulness. And so the expressive arts became a tool for me to start to learn and understand those principles and practice them and show up with them. And so I had all these kind of little like snippets and things. And then actually I was in a supervision session with my expressive arts supervisor. And, we were talking about this kind of strange call that I had, this like weird, what's coming next for me? What am I doing in my professional practice? And I kept having this like image of a crow that kept showing up. And I was like, when a crow makes weird sounds, those like kind of things, I was like, I kept thinking about that and being like, I kind of feel like that crow where I'm like hearing this strange call. And the strange call was to write, to like formally write. And once I'd said that out loud, and once that image of the crow kind of helped me make sense of that all, I was like, oh, I need to write about this. So it really started with me wanting to tell my own story and me kind of pitching to publishers this kind of piece around, can I show people what it's like to practice mindfulness through the expressive arts? And then it was built on from there, right? We worked with that, but we also knew that people would walk in not knowing what creative mindfulness was. And so we blended some nonfiction elements to it. And all along the way too, it was really important to me to tell stories. I have a background, even just academically in research around the power of storytelling. So when I sat down to write, I was like, I'm going to tell my stories, I'm going to tell my clients' stories, but I'm also going to tell stories about like weird and wonderful things. Like I'm going to tell metaphors and symbols and use stories to kind of bring some of these concepts alive. So when I was writing, I was very much like on the hunt for stories, right? I mean, I had some of them already, but I was really trying to like find from like, I've got stories from like film history, from sports history, from arts history. Like I was like, whatever the metaphor is, whatever the symbol is, like I didn't want to write like a traditional nonfiction book where it's like, blah, blah, blah. This is how things are, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I was very drawn when they introduced us to your connection to the idea, the concept, the practice of creative mindfulness. So I have a company called the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. It's been my company that's been in existence since 2015. And I kind of formally yielded into that name because creative not mindfulness is really the value, I think, that underlines so much of what we do as a clinical training organization, because we mostly offer trainings for other therapists in EMDR therapy and expressive arts therapy, and a practice that I have formally put together called Dancing Mindfulness. Yes, but yet I'm also very clear to say this is nothing I invented, because these practices are organic to the first peoples of the planet. And I like to say, if anything, I put together a format that people can use to access it in a modern era.
Mhm.
Yet all of that to say, the way I was able to access mindfulness practices was through the creative arts, because the creative arts, the expressive arts have been my sole practice since I was a child. They're the reason I'm still here and floating, and they gave me the container to express my emotions. So I'm hoping we could break down a little bit about what creative mindfulness means to each of us, because that's a phrase that people who are listening in may not have ever contemplated or have really paired the two together. So what does creative mindfulness mean to you?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you're right. I think it's important to talk about these contemplative practices through the arts have existed through time and space. We're not inventing, we are not like, this is not a fad. This is not,
Mhm.
it's indigenous cultures through time, space, present, any culture really has art at the center of how its people connect and make sense of the world. Right. So I think for me, what is maybe different about how I understand my own understanding of creative mindfulness, or how I'm defining it for other folks, but also how I practice it, and not to like show the contrast, not to like focus on what's different about what I'm doing, but there's kind of a cultural notion sometimes out there that like, if you're doing something mindful, you're just doing something slow, right? So this is more than just slowing down, right? Yet, yes, it can be slowing down and using mediums and that sort of thing. But really, I'm more interested in the process of observing and witnessing ourselves through the arts, right? So when the stories that I'm telling, or in my own practice, when I show up to paint or to write, the moment I show up, I have an intention around what I think I might be doing, what I'm hoping to kind of stretch myself towards. And that's fine. I start with that anchor, but inevitably, the moment I start to express, there's thoughts that start to come up, stories that start to come up. I mean, culturally, the one we know the most is that inner critic, but there's other voices that show up for us. It might be, fear. It might be like feelings in our bodies that show up. And so in a normal creative practice, you would kind of just motor through that, right? You just be like, go away, fear, push it away. Or, there's also movements to kind of normalize some of that and be like, oh, I get scared every time I create, and that's okay. And that is okay too, but I'm really curious about that fear, right? Like I'm trying to show up in my creative practice and being like, wow, that fear, it's there again. I want to listen to you. I want to get to know you. I want to be with you. And so I feel like for me, the expressive piece is very much about that observation and that witnessing of self. And it can be, I like to think of it as like a little petri dish, right? Where it's like we show up with an intention into this space, and then we get to kind of see all the ways we tend to show up in life, right? Like all of the stuff that we bring, and we can observe that. We can look at it there, we can kind of get to know it. And then there's also this beautiful thing that as we're observing and knowing, we're also realize like there's a part of me that's observing this, like this fear, this anxiety, this inner critic. It might be all sitting here, but I'm also more than that. I have this other part of me. And so that witnessing and observing part. And then I think that's like kind of what's different about the practice of creative mindfulness for me compared to other art practices or other creative practices that folks would be aware of. But also, in art therapy and expressive arts or music therapy or those sorts of things, there's also this beautiful sense making that happens through the process, right? When we show up to the process and we attune to the process, all of a sudden, images or symbols come out, and we find new insights to ourselves. So it's kind of that duality between the sense making and the kind of insight that we can find, but also that awareness and that observation that happens, and they happen all at the same time, and through in an intentional way. I don't know. I'm curious, Jamie, is that jive with, because you and I have never had a chance to talk
Yeah.
about that.
Because
Yeah.
even as I was reading your book, I was shaking my head and underlining and just having a lot of points of resonance. So I know my introduction to mindfulness in general, I would really credit through my trauma therapist many, many years ago, the one who really took me through a very deep trauma healing process, specifically with EMDR therapy, which is the main therapy that I do and practice and teach now. And so much of EMDR therapy, which I won't get into that, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There's a lot about it online if you're not familiar with it. But even the developer of that therapy, Francine Shapiro, studied with Stephen Levine and Jack Kornfield. She was a mindfulness meditator. And I began to appreciate EMDR therapy more when I realized how rich it was with mindful concepts. Like, just notice that without judgment. Go with something without having to try to figure it out. And even this whole idea of process or process, as our Canadian friends like you, I love it. I want to start saying that in American English because it's such a much more elegant way to say it. So being in process or process is just really integral, I think, to receiving good therapy, to not trying to force an outcome. And so, I really credit her with getting me interested in maybe more of the Eastern flavors of mindfulness and yoga, which is where a lot of the origins of mindful practice are. Yet prior to that, because I was raised very religious and into Christian denominations, but part of that was some training in contemplative Christian practices of the ancient desert mothers and fathers in the Catholic Christian tradition. And especially having studied St. Benedict quite a bit, and this idea that always we begin again, is when I really started sinking into this idea for me that mindfulness is always there. It's always been there. Whatever we call it, it exists in so many healing cultures and so many healing contexts. And as somebody who played with the arts through much of my life, especially my childhood life, I really started to sink into this notion that this is really where I found my meditation and my center as a kid growing up in a lot of dysfunction, was being on stage, was singing, was even just playing in my basement, playing records and choreographing figure skating routines and Broadway shows to them. And what was interesting was then when I started formally studying expressive arts with one of my teachers, who is a third order Benedictine, that's where I picked up some visual art engagement. And what was fascinating for me about the visual arts, I always said, well, that was my weak link, because I grew up having been labeled as good as a writer, as a dancer, as a singer, as someone on stage and theatrics. And, visual art was the thing I wasn't good at. And as my teachers lovingly worked with me, it's like, there's no such thing as being good at something. And maybe this practice that you see as your weak link has the most to teach you. And that's much what I found. And now visual arts. And that's why I just love the multimodality of what we do in expressive arts, because yes, you have your practices you may naturally gravitate to, which can give you a soft place to land. But then through ribboning them together, you may find the one that challenges you the most, but then ultimately has the most to teach you. So as I studied mindfulness on its own, studying expressive arts on its own, it was just so natural for me, especially as a therapist, to blend the two, particularly because so many clients I work with, most of whom are serious trauma survivors, have a very hard time sitting still. And if sitting meditation practice is your primary practice, wonderful. I have some semblance of it of myself throughout my work. Yet I found that I am only able to really be still after I have first moved, or after I have first engaged with something more demonstrative, something more creative. And I've also learned to really find the stillness even in the movement. So for many folks, doing seated mindfulness practice, even though mindfulness is really touted as this great thing that has enhanced clinical life, so many people struggle with being still. And with my clients, from the beginning, I've had to work with this idea that any human activity can be a vehicle for learning to practice mindfulness. Any human activity can be a vehicle for stillness and meditation. And this is just something that's resonated to me since the early days of my own recovery, because I don't think if anybody would have told me to just sit for 25 minutes, it would have been very helpful.
No, yeah. And that's the case for a lot of people, right? And so I think when you show up, so I'm going to guess the people that are here today, or the people that are watching this, have like some interest in creativity, right? Whether they think they're like a lay, like, oh, I like to dabble here, or you're, an accomplished artist and whatever. That all of that spectrum is like a welcome place, right? I mean, there's some people who would rather sit on a cushion for 25 minutes than make something, right? But as you were just saying too, I think that, where those practices where we can go to that are scary often have the most to teach us, right? But if this is the entry point, if you feel already like a creative person or somebody who has a creative practice, then it, for me, and I think it sounds like for you, it makes sense. Like, why not show up in this practice in a different way if you have the intention to learn more about yourself or find awareness? Like, how it makes sense to thread it into what you're already doing than, going out and being like, oh, now I'm going to do this new thing that's over there or whatever, right?
So this is how Keep It Real, my meditation and my prayer, my spiritual practice was at the beginning of my recovery journey. So I'm 20 plus years clean and sober from drugs and alcohol. And then my trauma recovery journey started just a little bit after that because it had to. And the very first recovery sponsor I had was a woman who was a very spiritual person overall, had just a lot of good practical advice for me. And she was really trying to get me into this idea of daily practice, that if you could start your day doing something positive, like saying a prayer or engaging in a meditation, that sets the tone for the day. And even as she was talking about morning practice, I said, Janet, I'm lucky if I roll out of bed, go to the bathroom, maybe take a shower, and then get to work, because I'm just not a morning person at all. And she said, oh, you use the bathroom every morning, regardless. I said, yes. And so she gave me a meditation book, a meditation reader, one of those day-by-day meditation books. She said, put this on your toilet seat, because that way, when you use the bathroom every morning, you will have to pick up this book. And when you're sitting there, you'll actually read the spiritual teaching it has to share. And she challenged me, if you do it every day for 21 to 30 days, I bet it'll become a habit. And now, more than 20 years later, that's still how I start my morning. I keep
That's
on the
great.
top of the toilet now. I don't have to keep it on the seat anymore. Yet for me, it was really, can you do something that's in your daily life path?
Mhm.
And that's the very practical advice she gave me that set me. So now my morning routine is a lot more substantial than that. Yet it started with that seed she planted. And planting seed, I'm so glad you mentioned intention, because intention is an important part of mindfulness practice, yoga practice. How the definition of intention that's always resonated with me is the seed that we plant. And of course, we have to water the seed and nurture the seed for it to grow and give it what it needs. Yet intention starts with that seed.
Yeah, I have a part in my book where I've tried to kind of demystify some of the pull or the tension that folks might already be seeing, where you're like, oh, but I do already this creative thing, and then you're telling me about this other creative thing, and I call it creating two branches in practice. So it's interesting to think about it being having the seed, maybe perhaps start with the intention to I call it creative living, right? Around, like, I'm going to live a creative life, and this creativity is going to be an ally. It's going to be a resource. It's a support that's there for me, right? So if you plant that seed of intention there, I think the piece that I think has been most helpful for me and that I've been able to support others with is thinking about two branches. And this maybe simplifies it more than it needs to, but I think it's helpful for understanding it. One branch is really about helping us to have this creative place where maybe we're doing skill, or, like, this might be your traditional creative practice where you're learning something, you might be displaying what you're doing or performing what you're doing. This is kind of traditionally what we think of as the arts. But I think there also is the opportunity to have this other practice, this other branch that shows up. And this is where you show up for yourself. This is where you show up and you are observing, you're noticing, you're bringing your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your growths, all of that sort of thing into it. And so, it's two branches. It's like a tree, and they all come from the same source, right? Like, it's all kind of emanating from the same source, but we have to hold space for one and we have to hold space for the other. But then what happens is we find that they kind of cross-pollinate each other, right? That when you cultivate skills, right? Like in visual arts, let's say, or writing or that sort of thing, it might help you to kind of really express some of those thoughts or those feelings that you're having. And the thoughts and the feelings might kind of trickle themselves over into your traditional art practice, right? And so I think if we think about those two branches, but then also really focus on kind of the center, the branch, the core that they come from, and that it's not a binary, it's not a distinction that way. It's and other things will grow as well too. But I think holding space for both of those things is really the goal or the hope for us in creative, and having creativity as a resource in our lives.
I love that. And to the whole point of living a creative life, that chapter title also resonated with me, because something as clinicians who incorporate the arts and who really honor this notion that what we do, especially as trauma survivors, to keep safe or to maintain our survival and even thrive, that is living a creative life.
Mhm.
That's living a creative life. I
Mhm.
remember, so I got into my recovery and began my career when I was working in Croatia and Bosnia. Those are the ancestral lands of my family. And I moved there after my undergraduate, largely because my life was a mess and I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so I had a job teaching English, teaching music, and then that's eventually where I got into clinical work. So this was just about 3-4 years after the war that ravaged the countries of the former Yugoslavia. And I read and I heard so many tales of things that people did to survive, especially when the city of Sarajevo was under siege, including like figuring out a way. And I still don't know how this was done, but I believe the report because I know how creative people are, like boiling down cheese and grass to extract some kind of enzyme, or no, it was boiling down grass to extract some kind of enzyme that would create like a cheese type paste, some of
Wow.
the that they were able to get. And I know how creative people are
Mhm. Mhm.
because I work with survivors of trauma.
Mhm.
And this is when I get a little salty when I hear people say things like in recovery, oh, you have such like horrible thinking or stinking thinking, or your best thinking got you here. Because I think in a lot of cases, no, our thinking is what we needed to do to survive. And it
Mhm.
was often very creative.
Mhm.
And so let's not shame people for that.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
so much more I could say about that, other than this idea of living a creative life is something that I'm honored to witness in working with survivors of trauma.
Yeah. And I think like the imagination, right? Like that's where we imagine, that's where we kind of untether ourselves from reality and think about new things that can be, right? Like
Mhm.
that's like it's an important part. We need to hold space for it, right? If we want to, heal, or we want to grow, or we want to kind of find ourselves in any way, we have to make space for those. It seems counterintuitive, right? It seems like we should, but really the imagination can help us like kind of lay everything out on the table and then be like, how could I put this together in a new way, right? Or a new thing. I think too that especially when we are in a time and space where we have so many challenges that we need to face. We have a climate crisis, we've got ballooning mental health, we have, polarization politically happening, and in other ways we've got, physical health that's deteriorated. We have so many things that are facing us. And so for me in my own practice and the work that I'm doing, I'm always trying to think like, is creativity the right spot? Like, is this really what I'm taught? And when I think about it, I'm like, yeah, because we need to be able to envision new ways to be, right? And the only way we can show up to envision new ways to be is if we are well, and if we know ourselves, and if we are, healed, and that sort of thing too, right? So it's like kind of that base around just taking care of ourselves and finding ways for us to know who we are and how we function in the world, and then that allows us to show up to the climate crisis, right? And we have these tools around like reimagining things and finding new ways to communicate things, right? So for me, I really, that's a question I keep asking myself, is like, is this relevant, or is this indulgent, right? Is this me just writing about my art and my practice and other people and they have a nice time, or is this actually going to support us in the world in this time and place?
Yes. Yeah. So much to that. I mean, one of my guides, inspirations through this work is the work of Audre Lorde. And even as you were talking, and I'm paraphrasing her quote significantly, but it's poetry is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Mhm, mhm,
Even in her life, she grappled with a lot of these questions. Like,
mhm.
what good is the arts really doing? And speaking about political polarization and the rise of a fascist style of thinking that I never thought I would see in any mainstream formats in my lifetime.
Mhm.
I saw this great meme on social media that really spoke to like why we need this. That yes, for all these years we've been saying, cut the humanities, cut the arts, and now because we haven't studied history, because we haven't studied meaning making, look at where our society's at, because arts programs are the first to go.
Mhm, mhm.
As I think the other thing art gives us is the power of connection, the power to see other people. And so much of the hate politics that I see being thrown about is a refusal to do that. So
Mhm, mhm.
yeah, there's just so much richness there, but I'm mindful of our time, and I just continue to applaud what you're doing, because I do think we have to help people reconnect with their essence. And what better way? And I'm sure you know this quote, this teaching that it's often attributed to Gabrielle Roth, but I really think it originated with Angela Sarayan and her research on the indigenous styles of healing throughout the globe, and looking at the 4 healing salves and what they have in common. And, you know, as Orion wrote, if you look in any shamanic society, you know, the healers will say, when they see a person who's not well, when did you stop singing?
Yeah.
Did you stop dancing?
Mhm.
When did you stop storytelling? And when did you stop relishing in the sweet sacredness of silence?
Mm.
And I think that is an accurate diagnosis of what's happened to our world.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And an invitation to find it again too, right? Like, yeah, that's beautiful. That's very, very salient. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If anybody has any questions, you can
Yes.
pop them in the chat, and we'll make an effort to go, because I think Jamie and I could probably we'll just keep going in all the directions we want to go. But if you are interested in having a question answered from either one of us, please feel free to pop it in there.
Yep, you can pop them in the chat, or I think they have, excuse me, the Q&A set up for that. I am battling a pretty bad sinus infection, so I apologize to you, Rachel, and everybody.
No,
I'm
no worries.
doing my best to keep my head up. Daphne, do you have a protocol you want to go through for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Please type any questions you might have in the Q&A box or in the chat. I'll pull from either of those and pose them for you. I've got a question to start,
Sure.
and that is, Rachel, how would you suggest, what are some things like for the first person, the first time they're trying to use expressive arts, or using their creativity for meditative purposes? Like, how would you go about doing it the first time, besides
Mhm.
reading?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I've got a section in my book that really anchors what those things are, right? And I think part of it is being really intentional about how you're going to show up, right? So that 2 branches piece is really important, right? If we try to show up in our other typical practice doing, whatever, and try to sandwich that in, we'll find that all of a sudden the process that we're making, we're like, oh, but this thing I'm making doesn't look good, or it's not really coming together, right? And so when we're on this other branch, we really recognize that if we value the process and we value what's going on here, then maybe some of the things I might make or discover in this process might be weird, right? So we have to be really clear with our intention first around where we're going, right? I really recommend folks come up with a ritual. And that can be anything. That can be as like elaborate or as tiny as one wants it to be. I think the ritual is really important because it's about marking space, right? So, and making this distinction around what your intention is and how you're showing up, right? So for some folks that might be like, I make tea, I sit down in the morning, right? Or I sit down at this time of day and I sit with my tea here and then I'm going to do my thing, right? Or for other people, it may be like lighting a candle. Anybody who works with me knows I read poems. Like, I find that reading a poem out loud is a really beautiful way to kind of center myself. And so I think that ritual piece is really important, especially where we live in a society where rituals are kind of evaporating, right? It helps us really note, like, oh, what are we doing? What are we showing up to? So I think the ritual piece is really important. I think having the intention piece is important. I think asking a question sometimes can be helpful. I think sometimes for people, they're like not sure about what the intention might be, but it might just be simply like writing out, asking a question, being like, like what can I learn from, this feeling in my stomach right now, right? Or what, I'm feeling really sad. I've been in this argument with my wife. Like, what should I be listening to about that, right? It can be something personal, or it can be something that's kind of weighing on you, and just having a question around that, right? And then I think moving into it, and again, I speak about this more eloquently in the book, but really noting in your process, like really resolving to show up and just trust the process. It's something expressive arts folks talk about and art therapists talk about, trusting the process, just knowing that like weird things might show up. It might not go, it's not going to go the way that you think it's going to. And so just kind of normalizing that for yourself. And then really observing, right? Really noticing again, those thoughts, right? So, this thought's going to pop up that says like, oh, you have no idea what you're doing, right? Or that lady in that webinar said to do that thing, but I think you're doing it wrong. Like just to notice kind of all that little bubbling stuff, and you don't even need to do anything with it. Sometimes I will recommend to people to have like pen and paper nearby and just to write out like some of that internal dialogue so that there's space between you and it. So you're not so tempted to follow it. I think that moving between mediums is great. And I talk more about how one might do that, right? Like it might be that you paint something and then write a poem in response to it, right? Or it might be that you move first and then you use that to serve your writing or your art or those sort of things. And I think another really important piece around it is I think writing as a close is a really important piece to it. It's something I support people to do. It's kind of like you do all this stuff, you maybe are like making something or doing something. And then if you can give it like a title or a word or write a poem or something, just so we can kind of like bring it down to some little essence, we can do those sorts of things. So again, I speak more eloquently in the book about that, but those are kind of some of the things that I would recommend for people about how they would shape a process like that to support it to be more mindful in approach.
I like the notion of writing to create more space. That's a practice that I recommend for clients quite a bit, especially because I do a lot of work with having people honor the different parts of themselves, the different aspects of themselves. And often what we talk about is like inner critic or these thoughts in my head. If you can put a character to them, if you could put a color to them, even doing some back and forth drawing with what they represent, it creates a real rich dialogue that is connective.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say too, like it's important for people that are interested, some kind of curiosity here, to know that like this doesn't have to be epic either, right? Like this doesn't have to be like I'm bringing my trauma into this, or again, my goal and my interest in this book is to support people to use creativity as a resource, to recognize that one of the big ideas that I talk about in the book, you can know through the arts, right? Creative knowing is what I call it, right? That you can show up in this expressive place and know and understand your world through that. And what I'm doing in this book is I'm using creative knowing to practice creative mindfulness, to practice mindfulness. That's what I've chosen. But I could have chosen to learn about the land where I live or my relationships or those sorts of things. And so if people are feeling overwhelmed, I feel like kind of scaling it down is really important, right? And it might just be like, what's happening for me in this moment? And how can I show up with intention to a short, small creative process? It could be 5-10 minutes, right? And because I think sometimes when we can get really big, we're like, oh, am I going to bring all my anxiety into this? Am I going to bring all my grief into this? And I tell my stories about how I bring my anxiety and my grief into it throughout the process of writing the book. I was in the process of losing my father. He passed away about a month after I wrote the book. And so that shows up in it too, right? Like it shows up where I'm feeling that and I'm kind of nearing that. And so some of those big things do move with it too, but also sometimes there's stories in there that I have around like just little tips with your partner, right? Or just kind of like not really knowing how to show up, right? And so it can be as big or as little as people need it to be.
Thank you. Jamie, what you just said dovetails nicely with a question from Carol that we just got. She says, can you offer some specific ideas about how you get to know your inner critic?
Yes. I mean, I think, it's a great question. I think we know them because they show up in our life. They show up in those little subtle thoughts that keep us from going to the mat or to the dance floor or to the canvas or to our page. Our inner critic is that block, the thing that says we can't. So I think they've been with us, but so we know them. We've just never really got to talk to them. We've never had a conversation with them. And there's this idea through a lot of parts work in psychology and whatever modality you might be using, that the key to really healing parts is we have to listen to them first. Because too often we hear this whole, like, don't listen to that inner critic. And whenever a part of self is ignored, they tend to get louder. So a practice like dialogue writing with the inner critic can be a way you get to know them. A movement practice can be, is there a gesture that represents your most creative self? And is there a gesture or movement that embodies or represents that inner critic? And can you move back and forth between the two? Putting on a piece of music that might inspire more flow. And as you do the movement practice back and forth, be open to any other gestures or movements or dances or flows that might come out. And then after your dance, you can take it to the page, you can take it to the canvas. So the answer is to not tell the inner critic to shut up, and it is not to like fully engage to the point where you give them whatever they want either. But we do have to listen, to get to know them, to engage, and then see how that knowing, the creative knowing, opens the path forward. Great question.
I would add to that too. I think that the non-judgmental piece that is so prevalent in mindfulness as well too offers us a lot around this too, because what the critic wants to do is it wants to judge, right? And it is very quick to judge. It is stepping in a reactionary place, like telling us this, this, and this, right? So when we see, like when we get to know its MO, right? When we're like, oh man, it always shows up just like this. And it always tells me exactly like this. Like when we start to do that observational piece, like, I mean, Jamie had the wonderful idea too of like giving it an image, right? Like I would say, get a magazine or something collage, right? Find an image of like what your inner critic looks like. And then I would offer like, but what does your wise self know, right? What is this kind of deeper part of you that is even deeper in there than the critic? What does it look like, right? And what are some of the things that wise part of yourself might say? Like, right, put a speech bubble and write it, right? And then what are some of the things that your inner critic says, so that when you see it, or the movement is great, just anything you can do to kind of take it outside of this swirling little jumble and out here, so that you can start to observe it. And then once you start to observe it, you can start to relate to it different, right? And some of the things that I would say around understanding my own inner critic and how it shows up is sometimes my inner critic actually is like, has wisdom for me too, right? So there's notions to be like, shut that inner critic up, like get it away, don't ever let it speak. And it's like, well, actually sometimes my inner critic is like, it's just scared and it wants to kind of keep me safe. So it's telling me, Rachel, prepare more, but well, it's not saying prepare more. It's saying you're underprepared, you're sloppy, some of the things that mine says, right? But really, maybe it is trying to give me like a direction to be like, be more, could you be more thorough here, right? It's just saying it in a mean way. It's not speaking to me as you would to a child. It's speaking to me in a harsh way, right? So I think it's that cultural notion of like, make it go away isn't very helpful either.
Thank you. There's another question here. She says, they say, I really appreciate your reflections on ritual. Could you both share more about what you do when you're feeling especially stuck in a rut, or when you're navigating negative emotions? I'd love to hear more about how you catalyze your own creativity in those moments, and where you look for inspiration.
So I am a big believer as a therapist, as a recovering human, that when we are in these ruts, when we're experiencing negative emotions, when we're going through stress in life, we actually cause ourselves more distress by doing everything in our power to hold them away. And I say that knowing and acknowledging that engaging or feeling with those emotions can be scary, especially if we've been socialized to believe that emotions are bad, or that we'll get into trouble if we express our emotions. A lot of us carry baggage around even expressing emotions, which could be an invitation into a practice, even exploring that. Yet I know for my personal ritual, it's whatever is needed to let myself fully feel the feeling through. And I've developed a lot of practices around listening to my internal world and my internal parts. They're very wise. And sometimes, like, I have this one very young part that will very loudly speak up and say, Jamie, stop trying to fix everything. Because when you try to fix everything, you remind us of mom, and that's annoying. Will you just let yourself lay on the couch, watch some TV, and cry? And sometimes that's what I do. because we need that. Our body needs that rest. I actually love watching television. I love watching movies. For me, that is very much a part of my creative process, because connecting with characters and connecting with great story writing or storytelling and writing is a way that brings my tears up. And I always get ideas and inspirations from watching TV or movies. So sometimes when I'm going through my biggest ruts, like not feeling so well tonight, having taught all day, that's where I'm headed after this, is to just really nourish myself with some TV and some soup and cuddle under a blanket. Whereas other nights, it might very much be you have to go to your guitar. There's a song that has to come out of this. That's why I really like being an expressive artist. And I want to hear Rachel's thoughts on this, because there's so many practices I connect with. It's like there's a different practice or a different variation or combination of practices to meet whatever place I'm in. And so even though like I do have a pretty set morning ritual with some of the things I do, the rest of my day can be different depending on what my internal parts tell me I need.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love that you're listening to the different parts of yourself in terms of the ritual too. And I might have said this earlier too, but I think that this is kind of just what's really challenging around ritual, is that most of us, not most, but many of us don't really have rituals for at least this sort of thing, right? We are kind of like, rituals are disappearing. And so I think this is an opportunity to be creative in how you show up too. I have a whole chapter towards the end of the book around rituals, and one of the creative invitations, in part 2, there's creative invitations for each kind of principle of mindfulness we're exploring. And so one of the chapters really is around to create your own rituals. So I have lots of guidance and ideas around how to do that. And that dovetails on me telling a story around a ritual that I created on the fly in the moment, when I was out in the mountains hiking post-divorce, like kind of a few years after my divorce, trying to figure out kind of what was coming next, and realizing I had this kind of sense of ego and trying to have this identity as to who I was. And I was in the story, I give you a lot more to this, but basically I was at the top of this mountain, like so deeply into this hike, and I was nowhere near the top. Like I'd been 8 hours in, and I was like, wow, I'm nowhere near, right? And I had this like feeling, this total breakdown around like, if I can't do this, or if I can't achieve this, then what am I? And it was a really emotional moment. And so I picked up this big rock, which I have back behind me here, and I hauled it down the mountain, and I went to the river, and I put some flowers on it, and I did a whole ritual around letting go of that part of myself, right? And so that was something. I had the emotion. I wasn't even in a typical creative space. I found an object, and I made a ritual with that found object, right? So that would be something kind of in the fly, right? But in that chapter 2 and in the invitation, I mean, I'm encouraging people to think about how they show up just to their practice, right? And for me, my practice is very much about, I light a candle, right? I write out an intention or a question, and I really spend time being still. And so stillness for me sometimes might look like just kind of closing my eyes and noticing my breath for 5 minutes, but more and more so what it looks like for me is actually getting up and moving and following my impulses. Because I find that when we can follow our impulses in creative practice, that is one of the best ways to stay with our process. And so I will literally just get up and stand and kind of move and kind of, do some kind of expressive movement around, do I need to move this way? Do I need to move that way? Sometimes I use music, sometimes I don't. And allow that to lead me into my practice. I often will set a timer, as you would when you're meditating or that sort of thing too, so that there's a beginning. When I light that candle and I write the intention, that's the start. And at the end, when the timer goes, I will have a little closing ritual around that too. And that's the container, that's the space, right? And that's really what we're talking about, is this is the container. This is a special space, and we move through the liminality and kind of on the other end. So you can be creative about that too, right? Like, you don't have to follow my ritual, right? I think it's an opportunity to be creative around what resonates for you.
Thank you. Diane says, hi, Rachel and Jamie. Thank you for this exploration of creativity in the context of healing. Rachel, what is the significance of the board behind you? And Jamie, I was so moved by the quote regarding the 4 selves. Who did you attribute that quote to? Wishing you and all in the conference grace and peace.
I'll get the
Yeah.
citation for it. Rachel, you can answer that while I'm grabbing the
Okay.
citation. Yeah.
The board behind me is my just like kind of inspiration board, my thought board, what I'm working on. It seems people have asked me that a lot lately because I'm talking lots about the book and stuff like that. It just so happens most of those things are actually photographed and images in the book because those are kind of some of the last things that I've worked on. The little squares are abstract images that I make where I tell this story in the book. I think it's actually the first chapter in part 2 around surrender in the beginner's mind. During the pandemic, I had this desire to like kind of let go of control, and I decided to do movement and kind of expressive movement around these little mini things and write a poem in them. So that's a number of those. The flowers and the leaves and stuff like that, that one of those is in a chapter in the book. And like I said, the rock that was there before. So I tend to just kind of pin things up that I'm working on or that I'm thinking on. And it just so happens to be that a lot of those things, because they were photographed not too long ago for the book, or there's other kind of ideas percolating. And I think it's nice to have a little spot where you can put things to kind of bring them back into your attention, or, you know, like I said, that, you know, your inner critic, it would be beautiful to have that collage image of what your inner critic's saying and what your wise self is saying, and pin that up on the board. So sometimes I'll have quotes or other things like that too.
So Diane, in your Q&A, I was able to text answer the attribution, Angela Sarayan, from her book, gosh, I'm really struggling tonight, The Fourfold Way. And to me, it's essential reading for anybody interested in the intersection of expressive arts, Indigenous healing, and contemplative practice.
Thank you both. We are just about out of time, but one of the things we ask authors to do, at least our children's authors, when we have school visits, virtual school visits, and I thought we could kind of use a little bit tonight, was, do you have any words of wisdom or other sage advice for, if not young aspiring writers, then all of us here today?
Great question. So I can go, because this is what I do when I do day-long writers retreats. I have folks come into the space. This is at least when it's in person, but I've adapted this online. And what I have up on the whiteboard is it's essentially a command: just write anything. Just write anything. And the first 10, 15 minutes of any writing class, I like to start that way. And I often get a lot of, well, you know, what do you want to start? Anything. And if you're stuck, start at the top of the page with that line, just write anything. And literally let anything come out. Because I think so many people I've worked with over the years, or even friends and colleagues who've interfaced with me, and they're like, well, how do you start being a writer? And they're so up in their head asking all these technical questions with how do I get started? And I remember once I was with a friend of mine who was just talking about it to death. And I said, Kat, let's just write together. Because it's been a pleasure to answer your questions and to talk about this, yet I find so many people get caught up in the talking about writing when we could be spending that time just taking it to the page. So just write anything.
It's beautiful. My thought would be, I wish I could put my finger on this quote. You all probably will know this. There's this beautiful Rumi line that's like, let yourself be pulled towards the strange, or something like that, right? Like, let yourself kind of trust being pulled towards the strange. And I think that, you know, when I told the story about even how this book came to be, like this image of a bird and this kind of weird, like I was hearing this weird thing be like, right. And I'm like, I'm not a writer. Like, I'm not, what is that? That doesn't make sense. Right. And so we all have those little kind of like strange whispers, strange pulls. And it might be like, you know, you want to do embroidery, or, you know, you want to go find a rock and pick it up and make something with it, or, you know, you want to send an email to this person and invite them for coffee. I think those strange little whispers are so instructive, and really are the things that can pull us in directions. And, you know, not that my life story or this example is everything, but I will tell you, as soon as I locked into that desire to write, everything just fell with ease, right? Like, I mean, publishing, writing, like it all just like, and you know, I think that's interesting because there's many other places in my life where I've done that striving, where I've tried to work, like Jamie's talking about, you're thinking and you're doing that sort of thing. But when it comes from that kind of deeper place, that deeper listening, that's often there's more flow and you kind of can, it takes you rather than you trying to pull it along, right? So we have to listen for those.
Jamie, Rachel, thank you both so much. This has been a real delight tonight. We really appreciate it. The book is Creating Stillness, Mindful Art Practices and Stories for Navigating Anxiety, Stress, and Fear. You can order it, the link in the chat at northshire.com. Thank you both so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye, everyone.
Y'all take care.